What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend?
Hello, this is Jeremy Blevins, and welcome to the very first Language of the Bible video. A good first video for that is talking about the different translations of the Bible. So what I want to talk about with the translations is there are three types of translations that are out there, and look at the strengths and weaknesses of those different types of translations, and talk a little bit about the issue of, are there bad translations? Should we only use one or two different types of translations, and should everything else be considered not good? How does that really work? And so first off, we have the types of translations. And there are three types of translations. The first is the word-for-word translation. The second is the thought-for-thought, also known sometimes as the meaning-for-meaning translation. And the third is the paraphrase. Now, the word-for-word, the idea is you're going to take and translate as accurately from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into the new language. So the focus is on the old language, looking like the old language, sounding like the old language in its word order, preserving the original imagery and figures of speech, the cultural references, and it's going to come out odd in its order when it comes into the new language, the English or Spanish or German, whatever language it's been translated into for this translation. It's going to sound awkward at times because most other languages don't use the same word order and the same thought patterns as the original Hebrew and Greek did. But it's good for specifically deep study. If you want to be able to go in and say, what do these words look like? Specifically, if you go to, like I do when I'm in someone else's class, I sit there and open up the interlinear and compare, at times, different words, go in and look at their Greek or Hebrew options so I can see all their meanings. And this concept we'll get into a little bit later when we talk about some specific translations later in the video. But it's very good for study, for in-depth study, to go word for word. The next one, the thought for thought or meaning for meaning, is also good for similar reasons of more in-depth study. The difference here being, while it works really hard to keep the definitions of the original wording, it's going to put it in a order that makes more sense in the new language. So if dealing with English, it's going to make more sense in English, and it's not going to be out of order in English like the word for word is. It's going to smooth out some of the imagery and figures of speech, its cultural references, and make them a little bit more fitting in the new language, so in English in particular for our discussion. And so figures of speech will be more English figures of speech. Imagery, most of our English imagery we can match up with Greek and Hebrew imagery, but there are times where we don't. As an example, the idea of God being slow to anger. In the Hebrew, the phraseology is actually that God has a long nose. You know, that imagery, we don't use that quite the same way. I mean, we somewhat do, but we don't, and so it doesn't get translated as God having a long nose. It's translated into God is slow to anger. Then the third, final form of translation, some people would argue it's not an actual translation, it's more of an interpretation, but loosely it is a translation because it's no longer using the original language. It's putting the concepts, the meanings that's expressed in the original language into the new language. It's going to focus on using the metaphors, the figures of speech, cultural references and concepts from the new language. It's going to be more simplistic English or whatever language. It's going to make it much easier to read. And so a paraphrase is good for a child. A paraphrase is good for someone whose goal may be to read through the Bible in a year. You're going to get through reading a paraphrase a lot faster. It's easier to read. And it's still going to hold enough of the basic concepts, the core concepts, that a beginning Christian or a young person can read it and grasp the most important concepts through a paraphrase. Now, you want to dig deeper. You don't want the paraphrase. You want the word for word. You want the meaning for meaning, thought for thought, because they're going to give you more of that original language wording and definitions that the paraphrase will not do. But it doesn't mean you scrap the paraphrase. And there are those who are diehard word for words. There are those who are diehard thought for thoughts. Not a lot that are diehard paraphrases, but the paraphrases are useful. Now, there are a wide range of different Bible translations out there just in the English, let alone looking at other languages. And even here on this image, you've only got a couple dozen. It's only still a small portion of what's out there as an English translation. And the English probably has more translations than most other languages, if not all of them. And part of that is because a Hebrew thought or Hebrew word or a Greek word has more than one option usually as a definition in English. People run with some of these other thoughts on occasion, and it may not be bad as a translation for that. But one version may do something better here in one spot and better in another. The most common for very conservative Church of Christ are the King James, the NASB, the NRSV, the New King James maybe, the original RSV. Coming more modernly, you have the ESV. And most of those you'll notice, as I mentioned, are here on this list, and they're word for words. More conservative Church of Christers are going to say, we need to use the King James or the New King James. And reality? No, we don't need to use the King James or the New King James or maybe the NRSV or the RSV. They're not necessarily the best translation. The King James in particular has a couple of negatives against it, some very serious cons. The King James is a very old translation, old enough that its English is pretty horrible. Even if it were a thought for thought, the English is pretty horrible. It's not the English of today's language. It's the English of its time period. And so it's sometimes harder to read because the English is not modern English. It's an older English. It's a European English, even at that. But it's also pulling from a smaller manuscript size because not all the manuscripts were found that we have nowadays to work from, to compare from. And so it doesn't even have the best manuscripts to draw from. Plus, King James, there are a few places where he purposely had the translators transliterate, not translate, but transliterate, which means you just make the word look like the original language word. Most notably, the Greek word baptizo is transliterated into baptism. This big Christian word that's out there. This big religious word, baptism. That's a transliteration. It's not actually a translation. The translation is immersion. The concept behind the word baptizo is to take and put the body completely immersed, fully down into the water, and then raise it back up. It's not sprinkling a person. It's not dumping water on them. Those are not the word baptizo. They're variations that are not holding to the true concept. The true concept is immersion. And that's an example. No, the King James is not necessarily a horrible translation, but it's not as strong as it could be for a modern reader. It doesn't have the good English. It doesn't have necessarily pull from the best transcripts, but it's still usable. The NIV is one of the most well-known, probably, translations, and it's gotten an update in 2011. I would say that the 1984 copyright translation is still fairly solid. The 2011 translation, they went and made some changes, specifically trying to gender neutralize. Instead of brothers, you've got siblings or brothers or sisters or something like that, and that's fine in those verses. But there are some places where they gender neutralize and you actually hurt the translation. You take away meaning from the real translation. An example there being, for the Hebrew thought, and the Jews in particular, the idea of the Son of Man had significant meaning, but this NIV translation will take away the messianic references of Son of Man and put them into gender neutral terms, and that hurts the translation. Now, does it do some other things really well? Yes. And you need to be aware sometimes of the strengths and flaws of a translation. And so it's good to be able to use a Bible that maybe has 3 or 4 translations in it, or to go and use your computer and make comparisons of translations. Because you're going to get to see there are similarities, there are differences. But by and large, they're about the same. So you get to see that, no, this version is not as bad as I've been told. I can go and read the New Jerusalem Bible, the New American Bible, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and it's not a bad translation. It may get a few things less accurate than some of the others, but some of those others will have something else they didn't do as well as one of the others. Especially when you're looking at word for word, thought for thought. Now, let me explain briefly. You've been sitting here staring at this image for a while. Maybe you've been trying to check out the different translations, and you've got to the far left, the interlinear, which is, it's going to give you both your Hebrew and your Greek, and underneath it, the line underneath it, the English, literally word for word, drop down. This word means this in English. This word means this in English, keeping, as the word for word does, the same order of the original text. And it's, you could say, the ultimate in terms of the word for word. So going left to right, you've got what I would call the strongest to the weakest. So the interlinear being the strongest, the Message being the weakest. That's not necessarily completely true, but within each range, you got the stronger thought for thoughts being the Holmans and the New Revised Standard. And you could say they are stronger maybe than the today's NIV or the newer NIV. Personally, the ESV I think is a really strong translation, and it's there higher than the King James. But other people will tell you the King James is higher. The RSV should be higher. I think they've put it in a good spot there. But it doesn't make it any better than the New Revised or the New American Bible as thought for thoughts. It's just that because it's a word for word, it's being put on the right versus in the middle with the thought for thought. So you've got to take more of the range of word for word, and you can compare those. Take the thought for thoughts and kind of compare those maybe. Take the paraphrases and compare those. And if you do that, maybe you do come up with the Message is the worst of the paraphrases, and then you can see there's a pretty big gap there. Some of the others, the Contemporary English, the Living Bible, may be a little bit more thought for thought than the Message. That's more what this is saying than the Message is horrible and these others are better paraphrases. They get more and more in line with the thought for thought than necessarily being a better, but maybe there is something to that. And I would Honestly, I would recommend Contemporary English or the Living Bible. But I know for a fact there are times when the message will say something really well in modern English. And it was designed to do just that. In the modern English, give a simple, meaningful explanation of something. And it's more an explanation than it is a translation. But that's its goal, and it can still do that well in most of its text. Okay, so having said all that, I do want to mention two particular translations. The first is, and you saw it, I'm sure you saw it on the list there, the Amplified Bible. And the second, the Expanded Bible. Now, you didn't see the Expanded Bible on the demographic there because it's based on another version, which was on the list. The Amplified is actually based on another version as well. And we'll talk about that here as soon as I finish this statement, basically. But both of these do more than your typical non-study Bible. These are kind of more like study Bibles in a lot of ways, where the Bible study will fill out a lot of historical information, archaeological information, cultural information. But even these two go even a little bit beyond that sometimes, because their purpose is to provide, I talked about comparing different meanings, different translations, to get an idea of different meanings of words and phrases and how they may look for different verses. Well, that's kind of what these two translations do. The Amplified specifically is based on the American Standard Version, the original American Standard, not the New American Standard, but the original American Standard Version. As you would have seen if you caught it on the comparison image, the Amplified is a word for word. It gives multiple meanings in English for either a key Greek word or a key Hebrew word. It doesn't do it for every word, but there's certain keywords. It goes in and provides extra definitions of those words for the reader, so that you can see these are the possible options for how to translate for what this word in the Greek or Hebrew means. And you can work out yourself a little bit, maybe what best translation you like. It may not necessarily be the one the American Standard used. It may be one of these others. They expect most of the time you're going to accept the American Standard as a good solution, if not the best. But it's going to provide those other options. It'll also provide alternate readings of a few texts based on textual variants. I talked about the King James not having access to all the manuscripts. Well, when a manuscript has a slight change, which usually meant the copyist added or took away something, tried to clarify something maybe, you get what's called a textual variant. And so sometimes the Amplified will give you a few of those alternate readings that come from those textual variants. And then you have the Expanded Bible. It's based on the New Century Version. It is a thought for thought. It was kind of on the tail end, the right end of the thought for thoughts. But it's a thought for thought, a meaning for meaning. And the way it works is your core text, just your regular black normal text, will be the New Century Version. And then it'll go and use different colors. It'll highlight wordings, use different symbols like brackets and parentheses and stuff to represent other things that's going to do in the text, whether it's alternate interpretation, whether it's an expansion of word meaning, whether they're highlighting a textual variation, whether they're providing some reference or a comment to historical, cultural, or theological information, or some other form of beneficial information that it thinks it can provide you. And it will use these different means to distinguish those from its core text, but give you those other things. And so they're like a study Bible. So if you're wanting to go dig deeper, like I talked about very early in the video, the Amplified and the Expanded are both really good choices because they're going to give you some of the comparisons. You can also find Bibles out there that'll give you 3 or 4 different translations, and those are good for that as well. But these will give you some of that other information that those versions don't give. And so maybe those are good choices for someone who's looking specifically for a word for word or a thought for thought. If you don't know anything else, maybe go look at those, because they're going to give you a wider range of information to work with as you're studying the Bible. If you're new to the Bible, my suggestion is still go pick up a thought for thought, and maybe also go pick up a paraphrase. Don't go necessarily pick up your expanded Bible. It will be more expensive because it's got extra material in it probably, but you go pick up a less expensive thought for thought, or whichever translation you want, and a paraphrase. The Living Bible may be one of the better ones to pick up. The Message may be a good one for that. And you can read your paraphrase, and then if you want to study a concept deeper, you go to your other translation. Maybe seek out a preacher, a minister at one of the congregations nearby, and you can ask them questions. Go to church, and I'm sure somewhere along the line in one of their sermons, you'll eventually learn a little bit more as well that way. Just give you one last look here at your different translations here. So go pick up maybe an NIV or the Holman's. Like I said, if you don't want to pick up the Amplified or the Expanded, my suggestions would be look at an ESV, look at the Holman's, look at the New Century. There are others out there. Another good one I like, not on this list at all, the New English Translation, or the NET is its abbreviation. It's also a word for word, and it's also really strong. So those might be ones I suggest, but it doesn't mean you can't pick up any of these and them still be useful, still be valuable for reading and understanding the Word of God and the gospel message in general. So I hope that's helped cleared up a few things, given you a little bit more information to work with as you compare translations, to understand why there are so many different translations, understanding a little bit more about the 3 types of translations and how to use them, when to use them. Don't let someone else pressure you to think you have to go buy a King James Version or an Amplified or an Expanded. I highlighted those, but I'm not trying to tell you have to go buy one of those. I want you to know there are pros and cons to different translations, and maybe you can go do some research. If you want to know, well, what's the strengths and weaknesses of this particular translation you're looking at, you can go in and look and find what is it that makes the New Jerusalem Bible different from the New American Bible or the New International Version. You can do that research yourself. I'm not going to spend forever doing that kind of in-depth exploration here. There's too many versions to do that with. But maybe you've got a little bit better of understanding of how to understand when you go look now at comparing different versions, different translations, what you're looking at, what they're telling you about those translations, and make a wise choice for yourself, and not feel like you've made a bad choice. And to know when someone else tells you, I don't know that version, I've never heard of that version, doesn't mean it's a bad version and you shouldn't have bought it and you've wasted your money on it. I hope you do feel like you've benefited from this video. I'm sure I'm going to have some detractors who think I'm totally wrong, and they're still going to want to go tell me, you've got to get this version. You should never, ever get this version. But that's going to be around probably for a long time still to go. But the idea is to cut out some of that to enlighten a few people that that's not the reality. Again, this has been Jeremy Blevins. Hope you've learned something, and I will be back sometime in the near future. Thank you.